John McCain's Phil Gramm scandal broadened today. It proved his top economic advisor was not only on the wrong side of the mortgage meltdown, he was also on the wrong side of this nation's effort to choke off the funding for international terrorists. Our third story tonight, the timing could not have been worse for McCain. He was speaking today to the powerful and sometimes controversial American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, not merely the largest pro-Israeli lobbying group in the country, but it is also a significant bellwether of and mover of America's Jewish voters. Just as we were learning that Phil Gramm has a history of making life easier for Israel's enemies and ours. More on that in a moment. First, the AIPAC battle. Senator McCain today described Iran as the foremost threat in his mind, bragged about his record on Iran, and ridiculed Senator Obama's call for a diplomatic approach.
We hear talk of a meeting with the Iranian leadership offered up as if it were some sudden inspiration, a bold new idea that somehow nobody has ever thought of before. Yet it's hard to see what such a summit with President Ahmadinejad would actually gain, except an earful of anti-Semitic rants and a worldwide audience for a man who denies one Holocaust and talks before frenzied crowds about starting another.
Ahmadinejad playing along today to celebration of the 19th anniversary of his nation's revolution, predicted today when Israel will disappear from the map. While those two rattled their sabers, the Obama camp had its own blades out. Congressman Adam Schiff cutting through McCain's argument with two simple questions for the Republican candidate about his Middle East policy.
How would his policy be any different than the president's? And second, if it's no different, and it appears from the substance of his remarks that it really isn't any different, why should anyone expect that he'll have better results than this president has? Unfortunately, he continues to cling to a foreign policy that's failed to make the U.S. or Israel safer. Iran's nuclear program has continued during the course of the last several years without abatement. Hamas and Hezbollah have grown stronger, not weaker. This has not only threatened our security, but Israel's as well.
But beyond the rhetoric, disturbing news emerging over the weekend about the substance of McCain's approach to foreign policy and whether it might actually benefit those who wish harm to us and to Israel. At the heart of it, McCain's top economic advisor, former Texas Senator Phil Gramm. As we revealed here on Countdown last week, Gramm on the payroll of the giant Swiss bank UBS, helping to defeat U.S. legislation that would give relief to Americans facing foreclosure. At the same time, he was helping write McCain's economic policies. Now, Newsweek magazine reporting that Graham's bank is under investigation for alleged use of overseas tax havens to hide assets of the wealthy from U.S. authorities. On September 20th, 2001, the New York Times reported that a single senator had blocked legislation that would have helped U.S. investigators track Osama bin Laden's financial network before 9/11. It was Phil Gramm, who still defended these tax havens after 9/11, whose bank was still lobbying Congress on behalf of tax havens as recently as last year, including lobbying done by this man, UBS senior lobbyist John Sabercool, formerly a legislative assistant to Senator Phil Gramm. Let's turn once again to Chris Hayes, Washington editor of The Nation magazine. Chris, thanks again for your time tonight.
Thanks for having me, Keith.
Where does this end for McCain with Phil Gramm? He's wrong on the mortgages. He's obviously on the wrong side of terrorism financing. I mean, what's left? He helped Angelina Jolie take Brad Pitt away from Jennifer Aniston?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot to run on, frankly, and I think in some senses it's an admirable display of self-confidence that John McCain continues to forge ahead with what Joe Scarborough called a program of more war and less jobs. But at a certain point, the broad Republican coalition, conservatives, are going to pull him aside, and they're going to understand that he can't win running on the issues that he espouses to believe, because they're in direct contradiction to massive majorities of the American people. Even diplomacy, we got a new poll yesterday saying that majority of American people want the president to be willing to entertain talks with leaders from the countries that we currently are isolating.
All right, what we saw at AIPAC today, if Phil Gramm helped Israel's enemies, I would think indirectly is the correct term here. How does McCain run on being tough on Israel's enemies?
Well, that's a great question, and the fact of the matter is what this reveals is actually a really profound contradiction at the heart of the Republican coalition, the conservative coalition, and McCain's campaign, which is, on the one hand, it's home to the most sort of chest-beating, self-righteous moralists about foreign policy. We can't talk to Ahmadinejad because he's an anti-Semite. At the same time, it's a party whose agenda is run by global conglomerates that pursue dollar and profit with no regard for any kind of sense of morality. And we see that in Phil Gramm's, advising of UBS and tax savings. We see it with Charlie Black, McCain's old senior advisor, who was at one point lobbying for a Chinese energy company that has interests in Iran. We saw it in Dick Cheney's Halliburton dealing with Iraq underneath the sanctions regime. This contradiction it blows apart this entire moralistic rationale that McCain and the neocons have used to justify the Bush version of foreign policy.
And to that point about the Bush version of foreign policy, yesterday in that speech in front of the Corn Palace, in South Dakota, when Senator Obama got up there in front of this overwhelmingly prairie white crowd, this sort of definitional middle to Midwestern American crowd, he was obviously, he got a good hand and good respect from everybody there. The loudest responses were when he said we have to end the Iraq war and we can't let George Bush have a third term. The crowd went wild about that. In that context, those questions raised by the Obama surrogate, Congressman Schiff of California today, is McCain in fact talking about doing anything different in terms of foreign policy in the Middle East than Bush has?
Well, the only thing that he's talking about doing differently is possibly ending the one place in which the Bush administration has gotten a little bit of religion about the need for diplomacy. That's North Korea. So he's indicated that he actually wants to roll back the one sort of plank of sanity in the Bush administration so far, which was reopening talks in North Korea. Aside from that, there's no difference and there's no daylight. And even for all the talk of the speech today, the kind of central policy proposal was some international campaign towards divestment. Well, guess what? Senator Obama proposed divestment legislation in the Senate. And why was it blocked? It was blocked by a Republican senator because it would have required the government to report on what businesses have dealings with Iran. And guess what? The business interests behind the Republican Party are not so fond of that kind of legislation. So even when it was on the table to do the single policy he recommended today, he was unwilling to lift a finger to make it happen.
All right, if there were no Phil Gramm, and in fact, if John McCain was not running, if the Republicans weren't running anybody, there would still probably be a perception that Senator Obama has a problem with groups like AIPAC. He goes and speaks to them on Wednesday. What does he need to do to finish, in their perception, ahead of McCain in the eyes of that constituency?
I think it's important that he provides a coherent story about how diplomacy, strategic, tough diplomacy, a just peace for Israel and America's security are all bound together. And the fact of the matter is, in this case, the day that President Bush was giving his speech before the Knesset, and he was talking about not talking to appeasers, the Israeli government itself was opening talks with Syria, whose president has said some virulently anti-Semitic things in the past. The point is that you can't just stop the conversation about what nonsense or what odious views are espoused by leaders in the Middle East, because you're not going to get anywhere. And if Israel can get somewhere and understand it's in their self-interest, their security interest, to open up talks, I think Barack Obama can make the case to the members of AIPAC that it's the same case in the United States.
We'll see if he can. Chris Hayes, the Washington editor of The Nation, once again on Mr. McCain's latest problems. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Keith.